Hello, I'm Bob McMaster. Welcome to another in a series of videos on the life and legacy of Edward Hitchcock, this one entitled Edward Hitchcock and the Geology of Rhode Island. Edward Hitchcock was one of 19th century America's most eminent scientists. His name is most often associated with Massachusetts. After all, he was born in the Bay State, lived nearly his entire life there, and taught at Amherst College for almost 40 years. But today I want to focus on a long forgotten phase in Hitchcock's research, his studies of the geology of Rhode Island. It was there that he had some of the first insights into the geological history of Rhode Island, New England, and all of North America, insights that proved to be pivotal in the evolution of the discipline of geology in that period, both in America and abroad. I came to realize that in the history of American geology, little Rhody loomed very large. The story begins on July 30th, 1830. It was on that day that Hitchcock set out from Amherst on the first field excursion of the Massachusetts Geological Survey, traveling in a rickety horse-drawn wagon accompanied by one of his students. It was a huge undertaking that would take him more than 3,000 miles over 4 years. Only a month earlier, he had received the appointment from Massachusetts Governor Levi Lincoln to carry out that survey, the main purpose of which would be to identify some of the Commonwealth's untapped mineral resources. But in reading Hitchcock's 400-page field notes from his Massachusetts survey, I discovered something curious about his itinerary. In the initial 4 days of his first excursion, Hitchcock traveled eastward through southern Worcester County, from Amherst to Munson to Sturbridge to Sutton and to Uxbridge. But on August 2nd, 1830, barely 5 days into his very first foray, he crossed the state line from Uxbridge, Massachusetts into Rhode Island. He spent the next 3 days traveling around the Ocean State. Why, I wondered, was he already veering off course, wandering about a neighboring state? Hitchcock was frugal to a fault, especially when on the state payroll, so as I read of his travels in Rhode Island, I felt certain that he was not on some junket or joyride. There had to be a method to the professor's meanderings, a scientific purpose that drove him as much as 30 miles beyond the Massachusetts state border. I was able to follow Hitchcock's travels by day and read his first-hand observations and impressions of what he saw, thanks to an extraordinary collection of handwritten field notes, letters, sermons, and related materials left by his family and preserved to this day in the archives and special collections at Amherst College. Here we see his account of that first day in Rhode Island. From Uxbridge to Smithfield lime quarries is 15 miles. Nice continues, though not as well characterized, to Slaterville. On that first day in Rhode Island, Hitchcock received an impressive introduction to the state's geology and industry. He first visited 2 quarries in Smithfield, one that annually produced 20,000 casks of lime, another that yielded enough talco slate to manufacture 60,000 whetstones per year. In Johnston, he came upon a granite quarry that was the source of the enormous pillars on the fronts of the arcade in Providence, a reference to the Westminster Arcade. Completed only 2 years before Hitchcock's visit, the arcade was named to the National Register of Historic Places almost a century and a half later. Then, at Cumberland, he observed a massive deposit of magnetic iron ore. More on that rock a little later. On the following day, Hitchcock traveled south from Providence. He saw coal deposits at Warwick, Warren, and Bristol, greywacke and granite at Tiverton and Little Compton. In Bristol, he made an observation that was the first of many of its kind he would make in Rhode Island and subsequently in Massachusetts. Huge boulders of one rock type, in this case granite, sitting atop bedrock of an entirely different type. At Tiverton, Hitchcock was particularly impressed by another outlier, one that he estimated to weigh over 5,000 tons. He said, There lies a boulder of coarse, gray-wacky conglomerate, nearly 50 feet in diameter, that must have come from the opposite side of Taunton River, or from several miles north, where alone a similar rock occurs in place. On his third day in Rhode Island, Hitchcock returned northward, stopping in Pawtucket, which at that time straddled the state line. Here he saw vast ledges of gray-wacky and noted, "On the west or Rhode Island side of Pawtucket, those ledges have been extensively quarried for flagstones. The layers of the slate are remarkably regular and smooth." Again and again in his travels around northern Rhode Island, Hitchcock observed a pattern in the surface geology similar to what he observed in Cumberland, Bristol, and Tiverton, large boulders of one rock type lying atop the bedrock of an entirely different composition. For example, in traveling north from Pawtucket to Cumberland, he found a single block of a distinctive conglomerate known as pudding stone, weighing several tons, that was surrounded by miles of talcose slate bedrock. One boulder in nearby Fall River, Massachusetts, known as the Rocking Stone, still sits in a park in that city. Perhaps most striking of all was that deposit of magnetic iron ore he encountered in Cumberland on his first day in Rhode Island. In his final report in 1833, after observing hundreds of similar displacements of boulders across Massachusetts, Hitchcock wrote, "Perhaps the example more definite and decisive than any other on the subject under consideration occurs in Rhode Island. In Cumberland, a large hill exists of magnetic iron ore, a considerable part of which contains distinct crystals of feldspar, so as to become beautifully porphyritic. A rock so peculiar cannot be confounded with any other. Now, if we pass along the north, east, and west sides of this bed of ore, even very near it, no scattered fragments of it are seen among the boulders. But on the south side, they occur all the way to Providence, decreasing in size. But I met with several pieces at the southern extremity of Rhode Island in Newport, of only a few inches in diameter. These must have traveled nearly 35 miles from their bed in a direction a few degrees east of south." Well, a trail of scattered fragments of magnetic ore extending nearly the full length of Rhode Island, from Cumberland to Newport, was truly extraordinary. It may well have been the first such boulder train ever to be described in the scientific literature of young America. There was a revelation in those stones, he came to realize, an important truth about the geological history of the region. On August 3rd, Hitchcock recorded what might be termed a geological epiphany regarding those scattered boulders. He wrote, "The north end of Rhode Island is a good place to teach the geologist not to rely on boulders for the character of the formations." Here we see a map published a century later showing the probable paths of 3 such boulders, one on Cape Cod, one on Martha's Vineyard, the third, that Rhode Island boulder train, the one described by Hitchcock in his 1833 report. There may have been earlier observations of such trains or boulders in North America. Hitchcock himself mentioned 1 or 2 near New Haven, Connecticut in an 1823 publication. And other geologists such as William McClure and Amos Eaton made brief mention of similar phenomena previously. But I think it is fair to say that Edward Hitchcock was the first to describe and document in detail such a long boulder train on this continent. Those huge isolated boulders raised an important question for the Amherst professor. What agency, to use Hitchcock's own term, could have carried such massive artifacts great distances, often leaving a trail of smaller stones behind? Edward Hitchcock, like most scientists of his time, regarded much of the surface geology of the Earth as the result of a flood, the great flood of Genesis, the flood of Noah and his ark. It was known as the diluvial hypothesis, and while Hitchcock was a man of strict Orthodox Christian faith and ill-inclined to trifle with God's word, he was also an astute observer and thinker, particularly on matters geological. and those huge boulders, some weighing 100 tons or more. What flood, however powerful, could move one of those, he asked. And why would a flood carry all that material in one direction rather than dispersing it randomly over the sea bottom? In time, those questions would lead him to a stunning conclusion, one that would overturn many long-held beliefs, both scientific and religious. The report of Hitchcock's Geological Survey was published in 1833. By now, Hitchcock had seen more than enough evidence to make him skeptical of the diluvial hypothesis, that notion that the great flood of Genesis was the force responsible for most of the sculpting of the Earth's surface. In that report, he wrote, "Making every allowance for the reduction of the gravity of these boulders in water, I confess I cannot conceive how such a work could have been effected by this agency," that is, by water. If not water, then what agency was responsible? It was a question that continued to consume Hitchcock until 1841. In that year, he received a copy of a geological treatise entitled Études sur les glaciers. The author was a Swiss scientist named Louis Agassiz, although much of the credit goes to several other European scientists, including Jean de Charpentier, a German-Swiss geologist, and Ignaz Venetz, a Swiss engineer. Agassiz put forward the radical notion that ice, not water, was the primary agent responsible for sculpting much of the surface of the northern hemisphere, that a huge ice cap had accumulated in the northern polar regions, gradually expanding southward over hundreds of thousands of years. It was a glacier or series of glaciers of massive extent, and it gouged, scraped, and bulldozed the Earth's surface as it advanced. When Edward Hitchcock read Agassiz's treatise, he was an immediate convert. In an address to the Association of American Geologists at the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia in April 1841, he described the theory of the glacial origin of those effects with evangelical fervor. He said, "While reading this work, I seem to be acquiring a new geological sense, and I look upon our smoothed and striated rocks, our accumulation of gravel, and the tout ensemble of diluvial phenomena with new eyes." He was the first American geologist to embrace the theory of continental glaciation, and his endorsement gave the idea wide exposure and credibility among American scientists. There remained a good deal of resistance in some quarters. Hitchcock himself backpedaled and equivocated on the idea repeatedly, but the evidence was strong and compelling. By the 1860s, that theory had been accepted and embraced by most scientists in America and worldwide. And it is clear to me that some of Hitchcock's earliest glimmerings of that theory came to him in Rhode Island. In May 1832, Hitchcock returned to Rhode Island. At Newport, he met Joseph G. Totten of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. At that time, Totten was directing the construction of Fort Adams in Newport, the largest such project ever undertaken by the Corps. Totten led Hitchcock around Newport and neighboring towns, introducing him to some of the geological diversity of Aquidnet Island. It was on the rock-bound, wave-lashed coast at Middletown, just a few miles east of Newport, that Hitchcock first observed another geological curiosity of that site. The site is known as Purgatory Chasm, a dramatic gash in a rocky headland on the Atlantic. What especially intrigued him on that day was one of the rocks he found. It went by the apt name of pudding stone, for it consisted of a dense substrate that looked much like hardened pudding, but pudding containing many lumps. The pudding was a matrix of fine-grained rock, much like mortar between the stones in a wall or foundation. The lumps were smoothed pebbles, ranging from a few inches to several feet long, and displaying a variety of colors, suggesting different mineral compositions. Furthermore, the pebbles were flattened, just as if some great weight had been placed on top of the rock, compressing them as well as the surrounding pudding. Also of great interest to the professor were vertical cracks passing through the rocks, piercing both the pebbles and the surrounding cement, separating them cleanly. Hitchcock wrote in his notes, "The cross seams of this rock have divided the pebbles as completely as if cloven asunder by the sword of some Titan, and an end view of the rock thus divided presents a quite singular appearance." In his final report on the Geological Survey of Massachusetts, he wrote, "No one can view this phenomenon without inquiring immediately into its cause." It was not until a quarter century later that the full significance of what Hitchcock observed on the coast of Rhode Island came into focus. In 1857, he undertook another geological survey, this one for the state of Vermont. Much to Hitchcock's surprise, he found rocks in the Green Mountains very similar to those on the coast of Rhode Island. To be certain, Hitchcock and his son, Charles H. Hitchcock, returned to Newport to re-examine the pudding stone at Purgatory Chasm. Those pebbles, he now realized, were formed much earlier, perhaps millions of years before the pudding stone. Each pebble was composed of minerals present in some ancient lake or sea, rolled and abraded to a spherical or elliptical shape, then deposited on the lake or sea floor, surrounded by fine sand, silt, or mud. Over time, that sedimentary rock was compressed under enormous heat and pressure, probably from hundreds of feet of rock accumulated above it. Finally, the newly created rock was fractured, possibly during cooling. The result was a metamorphic rock known as gneiss. What Hitchcock had stumbled upon that day in May of 1832 is known today as metamorphism. His ideas on the subject were published in this article in the American Journal of Science in 1861. It was a groundbreaking theory for its time. In 1906, George P. Merrill, an early curator at the Smithsonian, wrote of Hitchcock's 1861 article, "This paper, as a whole, marks a long stride in advance along the line of metamorphism." And it all began with those flattened pebbles cleft by Titan's sword in pudding stone that he discovered on a windy promontory in Middletown, Rhode Island, nearly 3 decades earlier. But so far as I can tell from reading Hitchcock's field notes and his 1833 report, it wasn't those flattened pebbles or those giant boulders that first drew him to Rhode Island. What was it, then, that he found so alluring in the ocean state? The answer is clear. It was coal. Coal deposits had been known in Rhode Island for at least 70 years when Hitchcock began his survey. Hitchcock was interested in Rhode Island coal for several reasons. First, it occurred in a rock formation believed to extend into adjacent Massachusetts. Second, one of the coal mines still active in 1830 was located at Cumberland, just a few miles from the state line. And third, he believed there were important lessons to be learned about coal and its economic potential in Massachusetts by examining coal operations in Rhode Island. One of the earliest and longest active coal mines in Rhode Island was at Portsmouth. It closed sometime between 1809 and 1816. Among the reasons cited for its failure were the lack of skill of the mine operators and the failure to sort the coal by size, although the practice of, quote, permitting the workmen to have from half a pint to a pint of spirituous liquor during the working hours was also considered detrimental. That mine was eventually reopened and operated early into the 20th century, as shown in this image. The quality of Rhode Island coal was notoriously inferior to Pennsylvania coal. Water content was high, impurities abundant, and it was difficult to ignite and keep burning. The problem resulted in many humorous references in the popular press. One witticism often quoted in newspapers suggested that the wicked should seek refuge in Rhode Island on the Judgment Day because it would be the last place to burn. Just a few years before Hitchcock began his geological survey, reports of coal in Worcester began to appear in newspapers, some encouraging, some doubtful. This article from an 1828 issue of the Massachusetts Spy strikes an optimistic tone. Of those who have seen it, the most skeptical are entirely convinced. Hitchcock had read such stories and visited that mine just a few weeks after his first Rhode Island tour in September 1830. The mining operation by that time had already ceased, and he was not impressed with what he saw, writing, "The rock containing the Worcester anthracite is most decidedly primitive. I am rather disposed to call it bastard mica slate." Hitchcock's doubts were borne out by later geologists, as suggested by this book published 70 years later with quotation marks around the word coal. It was more likely graphite. Similar reports had been circulating about coal beds in several communities in Bristol County, Massachusetts, close to the Rhode Island border. He visited those sites, noting that the coal he saw was inferior to the anthracite of Pennsylvania and Rhode Island, but he was not entirely pessimistic about Massachusetts coal, concluding that, in a country so wanting in coal as New England, a deposit of inferior coal is not to be regarded as useless. The time will probably come when it will be regarded as very valuable. For a time, the coal mines at Mansfield, Massachusetts, barely 10 miles east of the Cumberland, Rhode Island mine, seemed to bear out his words. A coal rush of sorts began there in 1835, perhaps prompted by the publication of Hitchcock's report. Several mining ventures were undertaken in that town over the next 80 years. Some produced modest quantities of marketable coal for a time, but none lasted. The last coal mine in the Bay State was abandoned in 1917. Despite Hitchcock's guarded enthusiasm, interest in coal mining in Massachusetts was short-lived. But the prospects for New England coal were not lost on 20th century geologists. In 1974, when I was a graduate student at Boston College, I heard the esteemed BC geologist James W. Skean lecturing on the subject, suggesting that Rhode Island coal still held promise. Edward Hitchcock was a man of facts and ill-inclined to formulate grand hypotheses without first doing the groundwork. He spent years traveling around New England, observing, collecting, and recording observations on the surface geology of the region. While his prognostications about the region's coal resources may have missed the mark, on other matters he proved to be far ahead of his time, his opinions highly influential in the advancement of knowledge of the geology of this planet. And it's fascinating to me to find that some of his earliest observations, some that would have the greatest impact, were made not in his home state of Massachusetts, but south of the border in Rhode Island. I want to acknowledge some of the people and institutions that aided me in my research. I am especially indebted to the Amherst College Archives and Special Collections for providing access to their collections of thousands of pages of Hitchcock's notes, letters, and sermons. For more information on Hitchcock's Rhode Island research, you may wish to read my article that appeared in the fall 2024 issue of Rhode Island History. You will find a link to that issue below. I also invite you to read my book, All the Light Here Comes From Above, The Life and Legacy of Edward Hitchcock, that is now available in print, digital, and audiobook formats. I have a website, www.edwardhitchcock.com, that includes much more information about Edward Hitchcock and my book. I especially encourage you to visit my blog, Hitchcockiana, where I post new insights and news on Hitchcock, his family, and his work. Finally, you'll find a number of other Zoomcasts on Edward Hitchcock and his legacy on my YouTube channel. If you enjoyed this video, I invite you to click the like and subscribe buttons below. Please feel free to add a comment as well. Thank you for joining me today.